take it seriously. They're the ones that are proposing that we deal with this in that way. So let's take some leadership on that file. But I certainly appreciate the comments from all of my colleagues, and I welcome further debate. Thanks.
Further debate. The member from Carleton, Mississippi Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will speak to Bill 66, the Great Lakes Protection Act, which I strongly oppose as a very wrongful piece of legislation that will hurt Ontarians. There are a number of points that I would like to make, and I will begin with speaking to the loss of local autonomy. The implementation of this bill will result in the further erosion of local autonomy for communities across Ontario. The continual destruction of local autonomy by the provincial government is based on the demonstrably false premise that the environment continues to degrade, that local municipalities and private landowners are the cause of that degradation, that municipalities are either incapable or unwilling to successfully address environmental issues, and that a minister in Toronto and his hand-picked people knows what is best for them and needs to set them straight. Many, many rural and Northern Ontario residents and municipalities disagree with that flawed and, quite frankly, insulting assumption. To that end, in an effort to inform policymakers of the needs of rural and Northern Ontario, the Rural Ontario Municipal Association developed the Rural and Northern Lens to assist policymakers to evaluate proposed policies. I want to focus on three specific questions included in the Rural and Northern Lens to illustrate a number of my misgivings with this bill. Number one, does the proposed initiative benefit or hinder the fiscal realities of rural and Northern Ontario? Number two, does the proposed initiative have a business case that accounts for low and sparse populations? Number three, does the proposed initiative have adequate human and financial resources to be effective? The truth is, we don't know the answers to any of those questions. Funds have not been allocated to Bill 66. In fact, the bill instructs the Guardians Council to recommend potential funding mechanisms. That would be the taxpayer, because we know one way or the other, that is the one who will pay, whether directly or through higher taxes or directly through higher product prices. In addition, there are no assurances that rural and northern municipal elected representatives or residents will be invited to participate. And even if they are invited to participate, that they will be listened to. Lastly, designated policies and regulations included within geographically focused initiatives will override the decisions of local elected officials, including local official plans and zoning bylaws. The structure of this bill is eerily similar to another provincial government boondoggle called the Green Energy Act. If the industrial wind turbines are so wonderful, why did the provincial government remove municipal decision-making authority with respect to wind turbines? Even after promising to stop imposing industrial wind turbines on unwilling hosts, the provincial government continues to do so, deaf to scientists, deaf to residents, deaf to taxpayers, deaf to municipalities. Given the open-ended nature of this bill, the question must be asked, what surprise does the provincial government have in store for residents that they feel it necessary to remove local decision-making authority? Time will tell, I'm afraid. Existing legislation. The provincial government claims that they need new legal tools to deal with emerging priorities. Yet, when asked what those priorities are, the government states that the Guardians Council will identify priorities sometime in the future. So the provincial government needs legislation to address priorities that they cannot currently identify. That sounds very suspicious. The provincial government is in the habit, when introducing legislation, of insinuating that a hole exists with respect to environmental protection. This claim could not be further from the truth. Legislation, policies, regulations, agreements, and organizations protecting the environment and the Great Lakes specifically have been in place for decades, including the Clean Water Act, the Environmental Protection Act, the Nutrient Management Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Water Opportunities Act, the Water Resources Act, the Conservation Authorities Act, the Planning Act, the Provincial Policy Statement, the International Joint Commission, the Great Lakes Committee of the Canada-Ontario Agreement, and the U.S.-Canada Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, to name just a few. To say that this bill will create overlap, duplication, and conflict is an understatement, and all without the oversight of the Legislative Assembly. This is a very concerning trend. Open-ended, vague, arbitrary legislation that allows the minister to consolidate power and essentially legislate on his own with little, if any, oversight. Accountability, which brings me to another concerning trend: the increased creation and or use of outside groups that are unelected and unaccountable to the electorate for regulatory functions is not an innovative governance tool. It is nothing short of the creation of shadow corporatist governance structure, the function of which is to bypass the legitimate legislative process. We have very telling examples of what happens when outside groups are given power and authority with too little or no oversight. For example, the lack of oversight and accountability of the Ontario Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals that resulted in an organization run amok, an organization that destroys people's lives because they can, because they do not face the consequences for bad behavior. The inherent conflict of interest created by delegating police powers to an organization that relies on fundraising, while addressed by the courts, still has not been addressed by the provincial government. In fact, despite their blatant abuse of power, the provincial government has recently decided to give the OSPCA more power, this heavy-handed, biased, unaccountable government. What conflicts of interest will be created by Bill 66? We don't know yet, but we do know that NGOs are not above using their lobbying power and appointments to target political enemies, including local businesses. An appointment to the Guardians Council could potentially be used to encourage and legitimize politically motivated attacks. Centralization and private property rights. Private property rights are the foundation of Western civilization and democracy. Private property rights are the underpinning of our prosperity. Private property rights and the resulting prosperity are the reason our environment has improved and continues to improve. Centralized collective control of land inevitably leads to a worse environment. This is demonstrable. Unfortunately, in Ontario, we have seen the incremental destruction of private property rights by all levels of government over the last several decades. I fear that this bill, with its ill-defined and arbitrary authority, is the final nail in the coffin of private property rights in Ontario, and therefore our prosperity and our environment, because without the wealth to fund investments into the environment, they won't happen. A self-evident truth is that private property owners are the best decision makers with respect to their property, as they have a vested interest in investing in and improving their property compared to remote, centralized decision makers who are unaccountable for the outcomes of their decisions. The best decisions for communities and the environment are made at the local level, whether by a local municipality or a private landowner. We know that increased centralization of decision-making and collective control of property results in decreasing prosperity and a degraded environment. One of the best, most visible examples of this phenomena is just a couple of kilometers east of Queen's Park in Cabbagetown. In the 1940s, a large swath of Cabbagetown was torn down to build Regent Park, a collectively owned and centrally controlled public housing project. It is true that Cabbagetown was a slum at the time, but it wasn't because the residents were lazy or didn't want a better environment, but because they lacked resources. Over time, as the residents of Cabbagetown accumulated wealth, they invested their individually accumulated resources in their individual properties, and today Cabbagetown is a beautiful green neighborhood. Currently, homes in Cabbagetown routinely sell for well over $1 million. Also currently, Regent Park, collectively owned and centrally controlled, is being torn down. Regent Park degraded over time because its residents did not own the land and so did not have an incentive to invest in and improve their environment. Centralized decision-making authority and collective control of private land will remove the inherent incentive of private property owners to invest in their land and will inevitably result in a degraded environment. Censorship. What is rarely talked about in this House, what concerns me is censorship. This bill not only removes the decision-making authority of local authorities, including municipalities, it requires public bodies to support the decisions of the minister. In other words, elected officials, land use planners, and other professionals working for a planning authority or local municipality cannot submit a dissenting view, even if the public is in disagreement, even if in their professional opinion a designated policy is unwarranted and will result in bad outcomes. The question needs to be asked, what ugly surprise does the provincial government have in store for residents and municipalities that they felt it necessary to remove the ability of local decision-making authorities to dissent? Public consultations. Notice for the public hearing for Bill 6, the predecessor to Bill 66, was given approximately 36 hours prior to the hearings taking place. The hearing was held for one day in a committee room at Queen's Park. The short notice period, limited hearing time, and location of the hearing disenfranchised many resource user groups, landowners, municipalities, residents, and other interested stakeholders who were unable to attend due to time and travel constraints. Given that the scope of this bill spans 105 of the 107 ridings in the province, and so could potentially adversely impact the well-being of the vast majority of residents, municipalities, people, and businesses in Ontario, I strongly recommend that the hearings be held in a variety of locations across the province and ample notice be provided to the public prior to public hearings being held. People have a right to be heard, not simply send in a submission which can be safely ignored, but be heard by MPPs and other citizens alike, particularly rural and northern residents who routinely feel ignored by this government. Again, I will refer to Roma's rural and northern lens. There are just 3 questions that need to be answered prior to this bill being passed. Does the proposed initiative ensure that rural and northern communities are receiving equitable treatment or services relative to other parts of the province? Does the proposed initiative accommodate the aspirations of residents from rural and rural communities and the north? does the proposed initiative build upon the input and advice of rural residents, communities, and municipalities? The provincial government needs to hear from a whole lot of people prior to passing and implementing this bill, so that Ontarians may ask questions and hold the government to account. In conclusion, a constituent sent to me a very powerful quote the other day that sums this bill up quite nicely. If you can't trust people with freedom, how can you trust people with power? The centralization of power in this bill, similar to the Green Energy Act, will not just disenfranchise private landowners, but also local communities. Rural Ontario doesn't trust this government, and for good reason. Past behaviour is the best predictor of future behaviour. We have witnessed communities devastated by the imposition of industrial wind turbines, which chop up birds, devalue property, and make people sick. So the arbitrary nature of this bill begs the question, what further environmentally destructive policies is the provincial government planning to impose on rural Ontario through this bill? Rural people are tired of being bullied by this government. Whether it's the utter mismanagement of Hydro One, the Green Energy Act, the imposition of industrial wind turbines on unwilling hosts, high and rising energy prices, the loss of 300,000 good manufacturing jobs, the Caledonia land dispute, the unnecessary College of Trades, the eco-tax, the HST added to hydro bills, the cancelling of the OLG slots program at horse racing tracks, the carbon tax, the Ontario pension plan, the list is endless. Here is my last question for the provincial government. Crown land already comprises 85% of the province of Ontario. How much more of our private land and wealth is the provincial government going to seize for itself? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The member from Toronto Danforth.